By spring 1945, US forces were closing in on Japan from the south and east. But to the west, in China, Burma and India, a separate campaign had been unfolding. Japan had invaded China in 1937. The United States had regarded the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, as a Western ally and sent aid. Much of it went in through British-controlled Burma along the so-called Burma Road over the mountains to southern China. Then, in 1942, Japan invaded Burma and kicked out the British. The Burma Road was shut down. Six months later, Britain launched the first of a series of attacks to retake Burma and reopen the road. The first, in late 1942, advanced down the Burmese coast from India. But the Japanese crushed it. The second, 9 months later, tried a different approach. Instead of sending in a conventional force, small groups of soldiers were infiltrated deep behind Japanese lines. They were known as Chindits, and were the brainchild of an unconventional officer called Ord Wingate. Their task was to destroy railway lines and disrupt Japanese communications.
Chindits, that's the name for the guardian statues which stand at the steps of Burmese pagodas. A name from legend that's become flesh and blood, living guardians of Burma's liberty.
But the Japanese soon began to hunt them down. By mid-April 1943, over 1/3 of the Chindit forces had been killed. The remainder were forced back into India. The struggle to retake Burma was becoming a serious problem. So, in late 1943, the Allies turned to US General Joseph Stilwell.
We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
Stilwell had spent years helping to overhaul the forces of neighboring China. The Allies now decided to put them to the test. Stilwell's Chinese soldiers, reinforced by an elite US group of jungle fighters known as Merrill's Marauders, would be sent into Burma. In October 1943, they crossed the border and made their way down the east side of the country. Meanwhile, the British India Army launched a diversionary strike along the Burmese coast. Finally, Chindits moved into northern Burma, deep behind enemy lines, to cut Japanese supply routes. The Japanese fell for the diversionary tactic and sent forces to counterattack along the coast. 2 divisions of troops from British India came under fierce fire. but the Allied forces stood their ground. They were resupplied from the air. They could now fight back, and 2 weeks later, the Japanese withdrew. But it was only a temporary reprieve. The Japanese launched a counter-offensive of their own. In March 1944, they invaded India in an attempt to disrupt Allied preparations for further attacks. For 2 weeks, there was intense fighting. The towns of Kohima and Imphal were besieged. But there was stiff resistance, and the Japanese were finally forced to withdraw. Over 65,000 of them were killed. It was a major blow to their military strength in the region. Meanwhile, in Burma, Stilwell's Chinese forces had fought their way down the east side of the country, and by May 1944 had reached the important crossroads town of Myitkyina on the old Burma Road. For 3 months, the Japanese held them off. But in early August 1944, Myitkyina was overrun. The way was now clear for Stilwell's men to push further on down the east side of the country. They were soon joined by a fresh force of Anglo-Indian troops under British General William Slim. This began advancing into the center of the country. In early March 1945, Slim's forces took the important communications center of Mektila. Soon afterwards, they seized Mandalay. With the monsoon season now approaching, Stilwell's forces dug in on the east. But Slim's forces pushed on towards the Burmese capital of Rangoon. They were slowed down by the rain. But by early May 1945, the Allied troops were 20 miles north of Rangoon. Allied reinforcements were now sent in from the south to support them. Gurkhas parachuted into the Irrawaddy Delta. An Indian division came in by sea. On May the 3rd, 1945, the Allied forces finally entered Rangoon. But the city was empty. The Japanese had pulled out rather than risk being cut off. The monsoon was now in full flow. But the campaign to clear the Japanese out of Burma was effectively over. The next stop in the war in Southeast Asia would be Malaya. But for all the success, Allied losses in the war against the Japanese had been terrible. The Americans were desperate to find a way to bring the war to an end without having to invade the Japanese homeland.